Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce's Ukraine War News Update. Second part there for the 13th of November 2023. Let's get straight into the military aid section of the video. And we're going to start with a confirmation of what was rumoured yesterday. It was leaked and now we're seeing this official. The German Defense Ministry has confirmed plans to double military aid to Ukraine in 2024. The German government now plans to spend 8 billion euros instead of the originally budgeted 4 billion euros for that purpose. No report says more confirmation of Germany doubling military aid from 4 to 8 billion next year. Confirmed. The German Minister of Defense, Boris Pistorius, confirms in a statement on television this evening, so that's yesterday, that the German government does indeed want to double military aid to Ukraine next year from 4 billion to 8 billion euros, and gives reasons. I'll just go through those reasons in a second, but I think it still has to be passed in Parliament. But I think there's broad coalition support for that passing. Anyway, Mr. Pistorius, we heard this weekend, says the interviewer, that the German government is increasing military aid from 4 to 8 billion euros next year. Is this due to the fact that Ukraine is on the defensive due to a lack of capacity, or the fact that the US could reduce its support, and possibly even more so next year than now? So Pistorius, the defense minister of Germany, says no, this is more a reaction to the knowledge we gained this year that the funds we had this year were exhausted very quickly, over 5 billion euros, and we don't want to find ourselves in a situation next year where we have to ask for more funds when the time comes. That is why this is an important signal, especially now that Ukraine has to continue its fight, and at the same time some of the public attention worldwide is focusing more on Israel. This is also a strong signal to Ukraine that we will not abandon them. So this is really, really, really important signaling from Germany. I've talked recently how Germany has basically stepped up, and I think there is this idea that maybe they're going to be taking the helm. This is purely my speculation, in Europe in terms of military strategy and being the hub of military thinking. They've been somewhat reticent to be so robust in terms of their defense spending and their defense posturing, kind of internationally, geopolitically, because of the whole kind of Second World War Nazism thing. And they've not wanted to become this military power again in light of that history. Whereas I think people have moved past that now, and Germany are happier to be part of the liberal world order and become an important integral part of that, and possibly the hub in Europe. They might even be looking at places like Poland that have been spending incredible amounts of money on stocking up their military hardware, buying an awful lot from the US, buying a lot from South Korea, and having their own joint sort of ventures with, say, South Korea to build just tons and tons of stuff. Germany might be looking at that and going, okay, from a kind of industrial point of view, Rheinmetall and German producers need to keep up there with kind of Leopard 2 tanks, and if we need to do that, we probably need to spend ourselves to keep those orders coming through, or then they're looking at Ukraine just to the east and thinking that it's really important that we support them because Russia is next door and geographically close to us in a way it's not to the US. There's that kind of immediacy in terms of Germany that I think is important. And I think Germany are reacting really well, and they've done a complete sort of 180 shift over the extent of this war. And that's really good for Ukraine. But I like the idea that they're being proactive. They don't want to get to this point, a bit like the US have been trying to do. So the US have been trying to pass this big package in Congress to say, right, we want $106 billion of spending on Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan, and the border. But so what this will do is kind of ring fence that amount of money for a year. So instead of keeping on going back to Congress and saying, right, we need more, right, we need more, right, we need more, just saying, right, we're going to get this big old package at the beginning of the year, and that will take us through for the whole year. And this is kind of what Germany are positioning themselves to do, which is like, right, let's clear this spending up front, so that we don't come a cropper later on in this financial year. I think this is great news from from Germany, and it's exactly what Ukraine are going to want to hear. Really robust rhetoric, and also literally putting your money where your mouth is. Well, not literally. He's not going to stick money on his mouth. So metaphorically, putting his money where his mouth is. Okay, this is a bit of a cautionary tale. So Max23 is a source that I often use, but I am aware that it sometimes gets a little bit carried away and doesn't quite represent the accuracy of things that are said. So the claim was yesterday, and this is in quote marks as well, quotation marks. Ukraine will receive the F-16s this winter. Ukrainian pilots learn very quickly, according to ex-CIA Director General Petraeus. No Reports does a corrective, so it actually doesn't say Ukraine will, but probably will, and all further statements are based on his own beliefs. It's not up to Petraeus to announce delivery schedules or plans. He also doesn't say they learn very quickly, assuming that this has anything to do with the faster delivery of F-16s. The real quote is, I believe that Ukrainian pilots are exceptional and they will very quickly switch from the MiG to the Su aircraft to F-16. So this is just a lesson to me as well. I need to be careful with the kind of resources I use. No Reports is a really good, I think, well-respected resource that isn't so blasé with the way that he interprets news pieces. So Ukraine may receive the F-16 this winter, but of course winter goes to the end of February. You're looking at sort of maybe getting on towards March being the beginning of spring, and that means that, to be honest, we're still months and months away. It's not that we're suddenly going to get it in December. Okay, so Ukraine may receive the F-16 this winter. Ukrainian pilots learn very quickly, the former CIA director said in an interview with the Voice of America. Quote, here's a quote, the provision of F-16s, which the Ukrainian Air Force will likely receive this winter, will be very important. I believe that Ukrainian pilots are exceptional and they will very quickly switch from MiG and Su aircraft to F-16s. So again, they learn quickly as a general claim, but it doesn't mean they are learning quickly on F-16. So we need to be careful of how we interpret these quotes. Okay, so hopefully they will get the F-16 slightly sooner than they may have been expecting and get them operational on the front line. That would be fantastic. Right. Military training efforts for Ukraine have hit major milestones. So just to reiterate that Britain has trained 30,000 Ukrainian soldiers, I think in a number of different ways as well. So there are training of paratroopers and Marines, as well as in special forces in Britain, as well as your normal sort of combat training for your recruits and whatnot. But anyway, 30,000 is fantastic, and that will continue. The EU mission expects to hit 35,000 by the year end. So you put that together, and that's 65,000. And then the US has trained 18,000 with 1,000 more in the pipeline. So we're looking at sort of 85,000 troops there. That's fantastic from those allied nations. The Buk M1 anti-aircraft missile system. So this is an old Soviet-era missile system used by the Ukrainian Air Defense Forces, is being used, or I'm unsure about this because I thought this was a done deal and they've been using RIM-7 Sea Sparrow missiles that are anti-aircraft ship-launched missiles that are being rejigged to foreigners. I thought this had been happening for months. There was talk about this sort of maybe even a year ago. But the quote here is, there is an announcement from our Western partners, we have already confirmed it, that we have good results of combat use at the training ground in the US of Buk M1 anti-aircraft missile systems that are converted, adapted to American missiles that can strengthen our air defense, Yuri Ignat said. So I don't know that they are using or have even used these in combat operations in Ukraine. But this is great because the Ukrainians have run out or are running out of the actual Soviet era Buk missiles that they can't make themselves. So if they can use what seem to be fairly numerous RIM-7 Sea Sparrow missiles, and I think another type of missile, I don't know whether Sidewinders or anything can be used on them, but I think it's not just the RIM-7. But anyway, if they can use these missiles on the book, then that is fantastic. I just thought they already were. Then there is this talk about Ukrainian SA-3 S-125 launches against Russian airborne targets. These are older S-125 instead of, say, S-300, S-400 missiles. Ukraine has had a pre-war supply and also received some upgraded Polish S-125 newer SC systems. So that is good that they've got some of these older missiles, and we are seeing these being used, I believe, in a ground-to-ground mode, rather like the S-300 are used by the Russians, because they have an awful lot of those missiles and they can be used in the ground-to-ground mode. The only thing is with the S-300 is that they are pretty inaccurate compared to cruise missiles when used in that mode. And one would assume the S-125, if these are the ones being used in the ground-to-ground mode, which I can't quite remember if it's definitely these ones, but you wonder about their accuracy considering they're even older styles of missiles. So so you can see anyway on Telegram there's video footage and imagery of these missiles being used. Right, moving on. Commander of the Joint Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Lieutenant General Serhiy Nayev, visited the Joint Command of the NATO Armed Forces in Brunson. The purpose of the visit is to achieve a deeper mutual understanding and improve operational interoperability between NATO and Ukraine. This is a sort of activity you want to see if you are expecting Ukraine to accede to NATO, which one presumes will happen. It's just kind of when. But yeah, working closely together with NATO, as they have been over time, but there's just more evidence of that taking place. Right, North Korea supplies Russia with a full range of artillery ammo, including gun and mortar shells and rockets, but their rapid appearance on the front line may indicate the real bad situation with ammunition in Russia in general, according to Defense Express. I'm not going to go into it, but it's pretty obvious because I said it before, which is that bad news that North Korea are getting, large stocks of ammunition to Ukraine, to Russia to fight in Ukraine. That's bad news. They're getting all that stuff. The good news is that shows that Russia really, really needs that stuff. They don't have that stuff themselves. Their production capacity cannot match their usage and the demand. So that is really good news. Every cloud has a silver lining, I guess. Right, moving on to geopolitical stuff here. Finally, Washington seems to be realizing it needs to pull all possible levers at the same time to shorten the war, defeat Russia, and save lives. Liquefied natural gas, LNG from Russia, at last came under US sanctions, according to the Financial Times. Now, this is weird that it's taken so long, especially because the US, you would think, would have a real vested interest, cynically looking at this, a real vested interest in LNG being sanctioned, because the US is a huge LNG exporter. So what's happened since Nord Stream pipelines have been closed down is that the US has picked up some of that slack, which is what led some people to think that the US was behind the blowing up of the Nord Stream, because actually they gained a lot financially out of it. We are seeing LNG being imported into Europe via, particularly, I know Portugal and Spain, I think, do a lot of importing, if I'm correct. But, Europe in general, in terms of LNG, and so they'd have a pretty good reason to sanction Russian LNG, to give them an even greater competitive advantage, not just from a kind of moral, geostrategic point of view, or at least, in terms of the war. Anyway, the US is directly targeting Russia's ability to export liquefied natural gas for the first time, in a move that would cause disruptions in global energy markets that Washington has so far been keen to avoid. So the argument is they didn't want to get too involved in that because it would upset supply. So if you start hammering sanctions to Russian LNG, then they can't provide the LNG to the global market, which means that the price of it goes up, and that affects inflation and so on and so forth. And it's kind of very similar to what they did with the oil price cap, and that was pretty sensible in the end, which is like, right, we can't disrupt the supply, so we still need the supply of this stuff to to the world markets, because otherwise it will shoot ourselves in the foot by causing inflation and an energy crisis in our own countries. So we need the supply there, but we need Russia not to make money off that supply. So you can still supply it, but we're not going to insure any tanker that's going to ship that for anything over $60 a barrel. Now that then means that the supply is still there, but Russia is forced to sell that at a much lower price than they would have otherwise done. And in fact, the price was lower than that oftentimes too. Although there are loopholes for that. There are ghost ships. There are, that is crude oil, and then it can get refined in, say, India and then shipped on, and it's still Russian oil that's ending up in different places. But then if India are the ones getting the extra added value to that by doing the refining themselves, then actually Russia aren't getting the gain there either. But nonetheless, here we're seeing the US starting to look into or put sanctions on LNG. So European countries continued importing Russian LNG even after Moscow's full-scale invasion last year, which triggered an energy crisis. Until recently, the US has sought to avoid disrupting flows so as not to increase pressure on allies battling a shortage, etc., etc. We're going to look at the next part of this, though, this Financial Times article, because this is the central part of it, really. While the US and its allies have imposed sanctions on Russia, energy projects in the past in response to the war in Ukraine, seeking to starve them of financing and equipment. This is the first time LNG supplies are directly affected. US officials sought to differentiate between existing supplies and those set to come to the market in the relatively near future, but acknowledged the aim was to hurt Russia's ability to profit from selling more fossil fuels. Quote, "We do not have a strategic interest in reducing the global supply of energy." So again, the same kind of theorizing, which would raise energy prices around the world and pad Vladimir Putin's profits, said the State Department. "We and our allies and partners, however, share a strong interest in degrading Russia's status as a leading energy supplier over time. Arctic LNG 2, located on the Gaidan Peninsula in the Arctic, allowing it to export to both the European and Asian markets, would be Russia's third large-scale LNG project, bolstering the Kremlin's ambition of becoming a leading exporter in the field. At full production, it would account for a fifth of Russia's target of producing 100 million tons of LNG annually by 2030, more than 3 times the volume the country exports now." So what this is looking to do is to sanction companies that are going to build LNG infrastructure that would allow Russia to up their LNG exports. Now, this is important because Russia was hoping to make a lot of money off gas exports through gas pipelines like Nord Stream. The problem for them is that Nord Stream was taken out and they couldn't then up their export of gas to other countries around the world, because you need to set up pipelines. That takes a huge amount of time, longer than it would take to set up like a liquefied natural gas installation, because you had to get pipelines going through different countries to get gas from A to B. And where Europe is saying, right, we're no longer importing this gas and we're going to get LNG from America, Russia has to react by saying, okay, we need to up our own LNG gas export, liquefied natural gas export. So US appears to then be saying, right, we're going to sanction firms that will be involved in building that kind of infrastructure. Arctic LNG 2 is led by the Russian private company Novatek, which holds a 60% stake. Other shareholders are France's Total Energies, 2 Chinese state-owned companies, and a Japanese joint venture between trading house Mitsui & Co. and government-backed Jogmec, each holding 10% stakes. So Shaistar Akhtar, partner and sanction specialist at the law firm Mishcon de Rea, said that US restrictions would in effect block the project for Western buyers. If you're going to comply with US sanctions, as most people will if they have any kind of dealings with the US, they will not buy the gas coming from the project, she said, unless you have some sort of license or exemption in place. So that's an interesting turn of events. Now, it's worth looking at Joe Blogs, who keeps an eye on all of these things, and his latest video is again looking at Russian gas industry breaking down as income collapses as Europe abandons natural gas for renewables. This has long been happening. What happened is that Europe was forced stop using Russian gas because of Nord Stream, because of the war. And everyone thought that that would cause Europe to have a kind of energy crisis. But what happened is there was a lot of reduction in demand. So I remember one big German manufacturing company is like, right, we're screwed. But rather than looking for other sources of energy, they actually reduced through efficiencies and whatnot, consumption by 50%. And then, so, necessity is the mother of all invention. When you're pushed up against a wall, you can get things done. So not only has Europe done things like becoming more efficient in terms of energy, but has also found sources elsewhere. So that, for example, LNG from America, the UK has basically gone from Russia to other human rights violators in the Middle East to get our oil or whatever, so to look at other sources. But so that has been happening, but also renewables. Now, I know a lot of people out there are like, really anti-renewables for some reason, but actually Europe has seen this as an opportunity to get energy security and also think about sustainability and carbon emissions and all those kind of things as well. And that has played a really important part in plugging some of those holes in supply that have been left from moving away from Russian hydrocarbons. So this is a really good video yet again from Joe Blogs to sort of discuss that. We'll just pop into the summary and conclusion.
So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because natural gas has been one of the biggest earners from Russia's point of view for the last 30 years. They've got the largest reserves out of any country in the world, over 24% of the global supply. So this was a fantastic earner from Russia's point of view. But the invasion of Ukraine has had a devastating impact on natural gas sales for Russia, and they have gone off a cliff. And as we've seen in today's video, unfortunately for Russia, Europe isn't hanging around waiting for these sanctions to be lifted and to buy all of that Russian gas. They've been changing the way that they're doing things. So we saw from the data on electricity production that there has been a conscious effort to reduce electricity produced by both coal and natural gas. And over the course of the last 12 months, natural gas has been the area that's seen the biggest reduction in terms of the amount of electricity produced. And that's been replaced by renewable sources of energy. Europe is focusing heavily on wind, hydro and solar, and this situation represents a change of strategy. There's been a lot of talk over the last 30 years about reducing carbon emissions, and one of the ways that the European Union achieved that was to replace coal power stations with natural gas power stations, which resulted in a reduction of around 50% in terms of carbon emissions. However, there are still carbon emissions coming out from natural gas. So in order to get to a net zero position, the countries of the European Union need to replace the natural gas power stations with renewable energy sources. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now. Russia's decision to invade Ukraine has actually increased the focus on renewable energy, and we are now seeing a tangible increase in the use of renewables. And of course, this represents good news overall for the globe, because lower carbon emissions and less global warming is obviously good for the planet, but it represents really bad news for Russia, because they're sitting on those massive gas reserves. And so what they want is the rest of the world to be desperate to buy that gas. But unfortunately for President Putin and Russia, times are changing, and there is now a different mindset whereby countries aren't thinking about natural gas, they're thinking about other ways of doing things. Now, as we've discussed many times before, Russia also has large amounts of oil, and what it's done with regards to the sanctions is to change its selling patterns. So rather than selling directly to Europe, it's now selling huge volumes to China and India. So the obvious solution from Russia's point of view would be to start selling natural gas to all of the countries in Asia. But unfortunately, from Russia's point of view, it isn't quite as simple as that, because you can't just load natural gas onto ships and sell it. In order to do that, you have to convert it into a liquid form. And to be able to do that, you have to have the facilities. And these facilities cost billions of dollars to construct. And let's not forget that much of Russia's land is in inhospitable areas. The climate becomes very cold during the winter. And so in order to manage facilities in those sorts of environments, you need to have the technology and the expertise to do that. And one of the impacts of Russia's invasion of Ukraine was that most of the big companies decided that they no longer wanted to invest in Russia, and in fact, they no longer wanted to operate in Russia. So Russia's lost a lot of that expertise and access to capital. So this is.
And then you add on to that sanctions, and they are even less able to produce those LNG facilities. So I think that gives you a good understanding of what's going on there. Right, on to other things. Finnish border guards reports a spike in asylum seekers travelling from Russia. So Finnish border guard reported a spike from travel documents, of asylum seekers arriving without required travel documents to Finland's southeast border in a statement on the 12th of November yesterday. So that is pretty, I think, reflective of how things are looking for the Russians, and probably the idea that you've got a large number of people who don't want to be mobilized into the army and trying to get out of Dodge as in any way that they possibly can. Right, Andrei Yermak, the Ukrainian delegation has landed in the US to discuss defense cooperation. That's led by Minister Yulia Sviridenko and arriving at the US presidential office. That is, again, this kind of cooperation between, I talked previously about cooperation between NATO and Ukraine, is the US and Ukraine. There is due to be Ramstein meeting this month, I do believe, still waiting to happen. So we'll see what the US can affect in terms of a change to support to Ukraine, both there and also domestically. See if we can break that deadlock in Congress. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said that he is ready to negotiate with Putin. No capital P there, but only if Russian troops, although capital R, so who knows, Russian troops only if they withdraw from Ukraine, according to Heilbronner Stimme. So Olaf Scholz really is, I think, positioning himself and Germany as a much bigger focal point in the Ukraine war, but also saying, hey, look, yeah, we'll negotiate with Putin. I'll negotiate with Putin, with Ukraine, but only if the Russian troops withdraw from Ukraine. And that is kind of like what Ukraine wants. So that is good rhetoric there from Germany again. Okay, on to some UK politics to finish here. And I find this pretty interesting. Now, the context for me personally, I've never voted Conservative in my life. I'm a lefty liberal, so I'm not a big fan of the Conservatives. However, David Cameron, okay, what's the situation? Right, there's been a cabinet reshuffle, and our Home Secretary, who is a really divisive figure, Suella Braverman, who is my local MP, and I detest her immensely, right? So she was Home Secretary and has been sacked. Really divisive. And it looks like James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, has been moved to Home Secretary, right? So domestic issues, the Home Secretary. The Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, is now emptied that position. So who's going to fill that? Well, David Cameron, who's our former Prime Minister that left after the shambolic Brexit vote, and I say shambolic from his point of view, I'm not casting aspersions over like the result, but he put that thing in motion thinking that he would win as the Remainer, and then lost, and then was like, oh dear, that didn't go to plan, and then jumped ship. Now, he's not been in politics since then. So this is a long gap, but he's been parachuted in. It is given a life peerage, which means in the unelected House of Lords, we have two houses. You have the House of Commons, where the parliamentarians are, the elected MPs, 650 of them, and the House of Lords that are basically put in place by the ruling governments. And so it's all a bit shambolic. Don't get me started on my House of Lords, and there's way too many of them, but it's supposed to be a bit of corrective to the House of Commons, but it's just basically, it's almost quid pro quo. If you do something nice to the government, then they'll give you peerages. So anyway, whatever. But David Cameron has been given a life peerage in the House of Lords, which allows him then to be able to be made Foreign Secretary. So he can be on the cabinet now. So this has all happened in a very convenient way for David Cameron. But I actually think this is probably, all things considered, a good appointment. Like, David Cameron will have more international gravitas than James Cleverly. No disrespect to James Cleverly, but internationally, everyone knows the former prime minister. He's got some gravitas, and I think him going around and acting on behalf of the UK as a foreign secretary, as opposed to him doing that when he is prime minister, I think is great for Sunak to use that experience and that knowledge and that kind of PR persona to the advantage of the UK. I think this is a good appointment. I'll be quite honest with you. Which is something coming from me, right? And I also hope this, what it pertains to this video, I hope it will be beneficial to Ukraine. I'm fairly confident, although I don't know for sure because I haven't heard him speak. He's gone and lived in a cottage out in the middle of nowhere for 7 years. I'm hopeful that he will be pro-Ukraine in the same kind of way as Boris Johnson was. And we haven't really seen from Rishi Sunak because I think he's uncomfortable doing that kind of international diplomacy thing. He's much more comfortable with domestic treasury type stuff. But anyway, interesting move there to get him in and possibly a good move from Rishi Sunak here because James Cleverly is fairly popular. I don't mind James Cleverly myself, and Suella Braverman was, some on the extreme right loved her because she was really divisive in terms of like immigration and all sorts of stuff like that. But she had cocked up recently and ended up being sacked over kind of criticizing the police over pro-Palestine demonstrations, and then the Remembrance Sunday stuff going on in London. It was all a bit controversial, and anyway, she didn't come out looking too good there and has lost the job as a result. Anyway, that's a final bit of geopolitical news for you. We'll see how that one turns out. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe and share. Take care, and I'll hopefully speak to you fairly soon. Toodle pips.